All right. Hey, Debbie, thank you for joining me. I think it's probably just as sunny by you as it is by me, right? It's kind of gorgeous here.
It's beautiful.
That's good to hear. So I reached out to you because of an article that I had read called Rediscovering Wonder, which we will definitely get into in a bit. But first, I'd like to talk a little bit about your background. From what I know, you're a principal of K-12 arts as well as learning design and development in Ontario, Canada. And as I mentioned, you write for our publication, Higher Ed Revolution on Medium, featuring one of Rediscovering Wonder, which is one of those articles. Would you care to add or touch on anything more in depth?
So I found it, first of all, I found it interesting that I was invited to be an editor on your publication because I'm not part of higher ed. I'm K-12 educator. I was a teacher for about 10 years, 12, but 2 of those years were maternity leave. And really focused in the junior grades, mostly grades 4 to 6, and then worked for the Ministry of Education, eLearning Ontario. So I've dabbled in e-learning for a number of years. And then I became an administrator in a board just north of the Toronto, just York Region District School Board, and was VP and principal in a few schools. And I also have some graduate work that I've done. I did a master's degree that focused on learning for English language learners and sort of disrupting the status quo around what do those programs look like. And that was about, I graduated in 96, so we're talking 20 years ago. And then I finished my doctorate in 2006, 10 years ago. And that was focused on really social studies curriculum, but it looked at knowledge building from a critical pedagogy perspective. So really, how do we, again, disrupt? How do we disrupt what knowledge is, who owns the knowledge, and what knowledge is considered valid, and then how do we transform that? So similar themes, I think, that have gone through all of my learning.
That's awesome. I mean, I would speculate that the reason that you were asked to write is basically because we value at Higher Ed Revolution, I think because so much of learning flows into that moment in a sort of a young adult's life. It's incredibly important what's going on right before that or even much earlier on. So there's no perspective that is irrelevant.
That was very good to hear.
Yeah. So I guess that one of the, so you've talked a little bit about what's inspired you. I mean, Paulo Freire is definitely in that realm for me. What would you say you still do as an educator today to continue to learn sort of on your own volition?
Well, if I turn my computer, well, if I moved out of the way, you could see my color-coded bookshelf. And if I turned my computer around, which I won't because it's a bit messy, you would see stacks of books that are waiting to be read. So it's really, it's cliche, but lifelong learner. So somebody will say a book and I will get it. You know, right now, one of the books I'm reading is this one. And it's to help with my blog.
Cool.
You know, and then I went to a session with Apple and they talked about this, and it's an older book, Campfires in Cyberspace. So like it talks about ancient learning and how does that, or prehistoric learning, and how do we build that into schools? So there, and I also teach. So I teach a principals qualification course. Mm-hmm. And I love this. I love that I've gone back to teaching. So I guess that is higher ed. Because I'm working with adults, and it just inspires me. And I look at my children, and if anyone reads my blogs, they'll see my children are throughout, because their struggles and their learning and their successes also inspire me to learn more. Plus Medium, to be honest, like I love the writing in there. I love that it's dialogic, that it invites that kind of discourse, where so many blogs, it's just, here's my thought, and then the comments are like, great writing. But with Medium, I feel that there is a back and forth that exists in that online environment that doesn't in others. So really, anywhere, everywhere, always, to your point, right? I know you write about learning anywhere.
Yeah. And I've just really started expressing myself through it. I've been reading on it for a while. I've even read articles that talk about how a lot of teachers are beginning to utilize it as a productive channel for communication and expression for kids, which I think is great. Opening that door and letting it become what it needs to or should or whatever it may be for the student is incredibly important. And again, to your point, highlighting their voice in the process, that is the ultimate goal. That's great. I mean, you can see behind me, I have some books, and above the bookshelf is a therapeutic art project that my wife and I did after we had first visited Maine before we moved here. So it was something that we have done. It's something that we'd like to get back into, but I mean, I'm sure you appreciate that, but that's such a positive role that arts has in our lives, and to take that away from kids is borderline oppressive.
I would say oppressive and abusive.
Yeah, for
There's
sure.
a great quote that from Brene Brown. I don't know if you've ever read her work, but she says, untapped creativity is not benign. And it's something that absolutely fuels the work that I do in schools with kids, with parents, that if we silence people, there will be a revolution. It might look like behavior, it might look like disengagement, but that's what it is.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I know my wife would as well. So just to touch on your article, Rediscovering Wonder, a little bit, what would you bring up the dynamic between the millennial and the older generation or generations. I'm definitely at the I guess depending on how you look at it, the later at the later end of the range for millennials, as I'm now 33 and a half. But in any case, just for simplicity's sake, I'll lump myself in with them. What would you ask me as a millennial that's gone through this system, both publicly and privately?
What would I ask you? I mean, so often we hear it's about the devices. Do you think it's about the devices, the access, the difference that your experience is compared to my experience?
I mean, you mentioned that a little bit in the article, and I think that it's right on. The devices really just give us, they're a tool. They give us access. We're increasingly good, and maybe it's the organizations that are filling in the needs to do so. But we're increasingly good at filtering, finding what is authentic and discarding what is not. So I think the devices help us when we use them correctly, and that can speak to any age, really, whether you're too young probably to be using it too much, or whether you're too old to really understand what it is doing for you. That being said, I have this thing that I feel about online learning or e-learning or whatever you want to call it, that what happened since maybe the mid 1990s up until about maybe 2010 was taking, in some ways, offline learning that was pretty standardized in a lot of respects, and putting it into the online realm to generate benefit from it. So it was offline to online. I think now we're at a point in technology and learning within that space where we need to take online learning offline, right? Online learning is inevitable, because of these devices that you have mentioned. But I think we're at this point in time where we need to understand the authentic parts of it, whether it's for communication, whether it's for, sort of bridging distances for people to learn from each other that may not necessarily be in the same region or locality, or whether it's just simply finding access to information, but then taking all of that and doing something with it offline. Right, practicing.
I know when we were preparing for this, I wrote to you about the work I did in my thesis, and I said in online and offline learning environments, and you made that connection then. And now I'm thinking about it, like, I think, so I wrote my thesis, or I was doing the research in the early 90s. I used an online tool with a grade 3-4 class around social studies. And what the dynamic that happened because of this access was that there was a shift in cultural capital. So the kids who had A's, and your typical A students, didn't like that environment because they had to share their learning with other people and they wanted to covet their knowledge. They wanted to continue to be those A students. Whereas the kids who were like Bs and Cs, they were, they wanted to learn from other people. And all of a sudden they gained capital, really. They gained cultural capital in that classroom and there was a shift. And so when I talk about that online to offline, it was really that you didn't need this online thing to make it happen. You did for them to see or to sort of demystify who has intelligence, who has knowledge, because they always felt less. And when it becomes transparent, it's community, right? And then how do you take that community and move it offline? And I'm thinking too, as you're talking, I'm realizing, even though I'm much older than you, almost 47. And that's a big difference when we're talking in terms of technology. I think the fact that I was an educator through this process, because I graduated the Faculty of Education in 92, I think 92 or 93, and started teaching right away and always embraced technology. So I learned with those kids, I always, and I think it allows me to have this sort of, like I can be in both spaces. And I think there are other people that are my age or even a little older who don't, right? Who don't see technology as a communication tool. They see it as a very different type of tool. And
they want to control it.
They want to control it. That's right.
Yeah,
and I also, as a woman using technology, it was very different. I think that my sensibility towards it was different. So a lot of the people that ran IT in our board at that time, they were all men. And whenever you needed help, they would come up and say, here, let me show you. And they'd push you out of the way. And I think that, I don't know if that's a male-female thing, but absolutely the way I entered into it was, you sit there, I'm coming beside you, and I'm going to coach you through it. And I would go to these IT meetings like a teacher with tech responsibilities, and I was the only woman. And so it was a different experience, but I think it's allowed me to sort of understand both spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I've never actually officially taught. I've mentored high school kids. But what I have heard from a lot of educators that I've spoken with is that, really where the real learning magic happens is when kids are teaching each other.
Yeah.
And I think in a lot of ways, technology, digital or analog, can make that very possible. And at this point now, it's just breaking down distance barriers as well, which I think is important. So you had a few pertinent questions about halfway through the article. Our kids have access to everything. So what could we possibly offer them? How can we keep them engaged and interested in schooling? And how can we make school meaningful? So as the takeaway from what we've just been saying is, or part of it is, if offering authenticity fuels their learning with meaning, which I definitely don't disagree with, what practical and concrete aspects of education need to shift or change altogether?
Okay, so you want me to answer that question? Okay.
If you can, I mean.
Yeah, well, I think that we have to get away from the idea. So you just said about where the real power is when kids teach other kids, and we have to get away from the idea that we are the ones who own the knowledge and we will impart this knowledge to you. I think that it's, to make it authentic, we have to be real as educators, and so often they aren't. Like what I wrote about just this past week was this. Again, it's like the control. I'm going to control this knowledge. I'm going to control this situation. I wrote about parent engagement, which is another aspect of it. But the idea that, you can't, you want parents to be engaged, but you don't want them to be in your face. And where is the balance? And I think it's the same with students in classrooms. So I look at my own son. He asks questions. He wants to engage in a critical dialogue, and he gets viewed by some teachers as having behavior because of that. Not that he's identified with behavior, but that he's a troublemaker. And he honestly just wants someone to engage in a dialogue with him instead of viewing him as just being critical in a negative way of them, not just critical in terms of a critical mind, And he actually recently, I don't know if this is relevant or not, but he recently had his bar mitzvah. I'm Jewish. And he was working with this rabbi, and the rabbi put this newsletter out to the community that said, when Trump was talking about his wall, he likes to talk about his wall, and he said, we should have a gate in the wall. And my son and I talked about that because I find that really disturbing as a religious leader, that he would, to me, that's supporting the wall. It's saying, we can say you can come in, and you can't. And so he went and he asked the rabbi. He said, I want to ask him this because I have friends from all different cultures and we're all immigrants, and who would write such a thing, and how can he? And he questioned the rabbi, and the rabbi said, that's not what I meant. I have to reconsider this, and thank you for bringing it to my attention. And it was so nice that he wasn't insulted or offended by my son's question. And Max came home and he felt validated and felt like he had helped the rabbi shift his thinking a little bit. That's what they want from teachers. They want to be able to shift a teacher's thinking. They want to be able to feel that their knowledge matters. And they want a teacher to say, I don't know. Let's figure this out together, instead of getting angry and shutting down the conversation. And I think that's where, that to me is what that's about, the authenticity, and also recognizing that they don't need to get knowledge from us. They can get it from a multitude of sources. What we need to bring is, what does discourse and dialogue look like? I think that I just read your recent article and you talk about that. You can't just say like they own everything, that there has to be some teaching that happens. And the teaching to me is around process. How do you just determine what is authentic and what is not? How do you engage in meaningful dialogue? How do you listen and question yourself? I just read, just to prepare, I was rereading Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And there's this one part, it says, so he says, dialogue as the encounter of those addressed to the common task of learning and acting is broken if the parties, one of them, is lacking in humility. How can I dialogue if I always project ignorance onto others and never perceive my own? So as teachers, we have to always perceive our own ignorance and allow students to project their own knowledge. So.
Yeah, I entirely agree with all of that. I mean, I think that the student is the primary actor in a lot of ways. And I think, at the very least, parallel with the teacher. And there are instances in teaching, I'm sure, I've seen it, but I haven't necessarily been the teacher and sort of felt that moment of vulnerability as a teacher. But where the teacher has to be learning from the student, the old paradigm, seeing, information transfer from teacher to student. The reverse is also true. Information goes from student to teacher. What I'm really interested in, because, part of what I'm doing with these guys at Oplerno is finding ways to engage people in this process of, post-secondary learning and educational opportunity. That's really the essence behind the article and why I wrote that and sort of published that as my first one in the Higher Ed Revolution publication. But it's how can we engage students' voice? So listening is definitely a part of it, as you're saying, allowing them to ask questions. I'm curious. Is there anything else you can think about that would potentially empower the role of the student as primary actor?
So I actually recently just visited Texas. We were visiting some schools that are partnered with Apple, and one of the things that one of the teachers said is, when I enter into new learning with the students, I just ask them, how do you want to learn this? Mm-hmm. It seems so simple. We craft these experiences for children, or students, I should say, because we're talking older students as well. Right. And we need to ask them, how do you want to learn this?
Yeah.
I think that's one way. So the idea of, okay, we can connect online, but how do we connect offline? And I also think that there needs to be action tied to the learning. So the idea of a practicum, something meaningful. Why did you come to this? These online schools for me are fascinating. I'm taking a course right now through Stanford on math teaching through my board. Like they're paying for it for us, but it's a course with an amazing leader in mathematics education, and I think it costs $80 a person. And there's a couple courses I'm waiting to take now, and I think they're $30, $40 a class. So I think in your article you talk about they still cost something, but it's a lot less than a traditional university education. And these ideas and the ideas to engage in courses come at a time when it's when I want it, it's meaningful, and I have the time to do it and the flexibility to do it. So I think all of those pieces play in, but it's also how. It's not just, okay, I want to learn online, because online learning, to your point earlier, can be the same as a traditional classroom. In the course I'm teaching, I probably shouldn't say this, but post your response and then respond to two others. It's like, well, that's authentic. Like that to me is the beginning when online learning started happening. And this free-flowing discourse is something that that we can do now, given the technology that exists.
Yeah. I feel in a lot of ways we're trying to double down on designing our curriculum in the syllabi that go with it. But I think it needs to be going in the opposite direction. I feel, one thing I had suggested is, maybe we think about it for the professors or the facilitators, whatever you want to call them, that are designing these courses. Maybe they put together some sort of skeleton syllabus, and from there,
responsive.
When you bring in your cohort, right, that's going to evolve. I read about some girl who's taking poetry courses online over and over again because she loves the community. So can you imagine how that course could evolve over time if the contribution and learning, it's not just this sort of like segmented group of subjects to graduate and be done with and then move on to the next. It's sort of something that sort of morphs as it goes. I think there's a lot of power in that. So I'm really glad to hear that you feel that way. Digital technology and capabilities, they're a significant factor affecting education today, as we've been saying. I don't know if you read anything that Will Richardson writes, but he had an article recently talking about elephants in the classroom that should unsettle us. And in this article, he says, we know that learning that sticks is usually learned informally, that explicit knowledge accounts for very little of our success in professions. Instead, tacit knowledge and the ability to learn from others in the moment, both face-to-face and in networks, is vastly more important and effective. Most of what we teach kids, we teach them just in case they may need to know it someday, primarily because the system is still operating on the belief that explicit knowledge is scarce. Within the web, it's not. Those that will flourish in the modern world will be those who can learn what they need to learn just in time from a variety of networks and sources and experiences. I'm curious, obviously this touches on a lot of what we've been talking about, but what does that mean for all of what you do, not just the role of the traditional classroom, but specifically with arts, specifically with learning design and working with professional development for adults?
I think with the learning design piece, so my team, what we do is we create communication and learning for the adults in the system. So it could be teachers, it can also be caretaking staff, office staff. And one way we try to stay current is to participate ourselves in this learning. We've been going to a learning conference with Elliot Maisy every year. And one of the pieces I find interesting is gamification. I'm actually torn about gamification because I feel that it's preying upon people's addictive personalities. I've never been a gamer, and that's probably part of it. So one part of technology I myself have never embraced. In the day I sort of like Tetris, but I grew up with Pong, like just to give you an idea of how old I am. It's just I think that I find it problematic. I like the leaderboards. I think that that's something that does inspire people to keep going, but it's not really inspiration. It's addictive. It's like, give me another hit, give me another hit. So that part for me, I'm questioning. I think also, we're trying to take the information, the learning, and put it into smaller and smaller pieces because people's attention is weaker and weaker. So even when I started in the group two years ago, our videos were like, they have to be under 10 minutes. It's 2 years later, and research is telling us they have to be under 3 minutes or people will lose attention. Right. And even in Medium, when you look and you see how many people have read it, but the percentage of what they've read, I don't know how they figure that out, how fast you scroll through, I don't know. But I find that fascinating. I think that we also have to have, higher expectations of our learners. I think that if it's intriguing and inspiring, they will stay with it. So, like in an elementary classroom, when we talk about behavior, and then all these teachers come up with these ways to manage behavior. It's called classroom management. And they have, 1, 2, 3 magic, or all of these hokey kind of ways to control it. But if your program is intriguing, you don't have behavior. And I think it's the same thing with online learning. Put some effort into it.
Yeah.
Make sure it's responsive. Your idea that you're saying that there's a syllabus, but there needs to be flexibility and responsiveness to it. So we're trying to create tools that are like that. You can pick and choose your topics. You can match them together. There's online content, there's webcasts, different ways of learning, but there's also reading material that can be downloaded. So you can use that in your own time, infographics, images instead of words.
Mm-hmm.
We're experimenting with all of this.
Yeah, I love the idea of all of that sort of being incorporated as just potential, and that the teacher knows that the students know it, and there's really it's an open canvas for learning in any space at any age.
The other thing that we're finding too, and I don't know what the laws are in the U.S., but it's accessibility standards with online learning. People who are visually impaired, hearing impaired, and we have to adjust the content that we're making. We have to offer alternative formats for what we're making. So it might be that if it's a video, there's captioning, but that benefits everybody. And so these accessibility laws have pushed us to have multiple ways of learning in everything that we create. I think it's a good thing.
That's a positive development, absolutely. Yeah. All right. Well, so let me just ask one final question. Yeah. And it definitely relates to us at Oplerno a little bit, but I'm curious, since you are an educator and you've been so and now are so, you continue to be in a multitude of capacities with a variety of ages. What skill subjects or topics would you consider designing or building a learning community around if you had to do so in a very sort of targeted way online?
I would love to design my own learning for people who are in the role of principal and vice principal. I think that there needs to be a new way of learning for leaders. I think that leaders in schools traditionally we call them instructional leaders. And now there's a new language around it, lead learner. And the idea is that you have to show your vulnerability. You, just like a teacher in a classroom in a traditional sense, principals and vice principals in schools try to create this image of themselves that is so inauthentic. And I think what it does is it keeps teachers from expanding in their way of learning. I mean, often teachers do it in spite of the leadership in the school. Yeah. But it trickles down, right? That expression, the fish rots from the head. And, and I think that, there are so many people that go into leadership and education who don't have to continue learning. They've got their courses, that's their goal, they've accomplished it. They really don't have to do any other learning, whereas teachers continue to take additional qualifications course and get exposed to learning. Principals can be the only principal with no VP in a school. And so where's your network? And I think we have to disrupt that a little bit. I would love to design a course around that.
Well, one of the things that surprised me doing that kind of work is that some of the most conservative voices, to my mind, are from the students.
Doing is taking a look at, student loan debt and its relationship to financial aid and how financial aid gets calculated. Okay, the calculations are pretty straightforward, and to be perfectly honest, they're quite fair in terms of they look at in the U.S. the income levels of the parents.
And at the same time, there was a lot of outrage about the banks being bailed out. I mean, this was public, as we all know, as we recall that history.